The first thing Claire Bennet heard when she opened her eyes was her own name, spoken in a voice that was supposed to love her, followed by a sentence that stopped her heart colder than any accident ever could. Once the second dose kicks in, no one will ever know it wasn't the crash that finished her. For 3 full seconds, Claire lay perfectly still in a hospital bed she did not remember entering, staring at a ceiling she did not recognize, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that the man saying those words was her husband. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances even when the world gives you every reason to stop believing, we would be so grateful if you liked this video, left a comment telling us where you are watching from, shared it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Our community grows because people like you choose to believe that broken things can still be made whole, and that means more to us than you know. Now, let's step back into Claire's story, to the morning everything in her life quietly began to unravel. Claire Bennet was 34 years old, and for most of her adult life she had built things. She had built a small graphic design studio out of a spare bedroom in Portland, growing it, client by client, into a business with 11 employees and a waiting list. She had built a marriage with Gregory Bennet, a real estate developer with an easy smile and an even easier way of making people feel like the only person in the room, over 8 careful years. And she had built, most quietly and most fiercely, a version of herself that believed hard work and loyalty were rewarded eventually, even when the road bent in ways she didn't expect. She was not a naive woman. She noticed things. She noticed when Gregory started taking calls on the back porch with the sliding door shut. She noticed when his cologne changed, subtle and unfamiliar, sometime around the spring. She noticed the way her mother-in-law, Diane, had started looking at her with something that resembled pity rather than warmth. But Claire was also a woman raised by a father who repaired watches for a living, a man who taught her that most things that looked broken were only in need of patience and the right tool, and so she had chosen, again and again, to believe that whatever strain had crept into her marriage could still be repaired if she was patient enough, if she loved hard enough, if she simply waited for the right moment to open the case and look inside. The morning of the accident had been ordinary in every way that made its ending feel more impossible. Claire had left the house at 7:15, coffee in one hand, a rolled-up set of branding mock-ups in the other, heading to meet a client in the design district. The sky over Portland was the pale gray it always was that time of year, not quite raining, not quite clear, and she remembered thinking, as she pulled out of the driveway, that she needed to call her sister Margaret back about their father's upcoming birthday. She remembered the light turning green at the intersection near the river. She remembered the flash of a delivery truck running the red from the cross street, the terrible weightless second before impact, and then nothing at all, a complete and merciful blankness, until the moment she woke up in a hospital room that was unmistakably, unnervingly nicer than any hospital room she had ever seen. The walls were a soft cream color instead of institutional white. There was a leather armchair in the corner, a small refrigerator humming quietly beneath a window with real curtains instead of blinds, and a bouquet of white lilies on the table beside her bed that must have cost more than her weekly grocery budget. Claire lay there for a long moment, disoriented, cataloging the strangeness of her surroundings, before she noticed the door was not quite shut, and beyond it, in the hallway, 2 voices were speaking in low, urgent tones that she was not meant to hear. The first voice belonged to Gregory. There was no mistaking it, even lowered to a near whisper. She had known that voice across dinner tables and delivery rooms and long car rides for 8 years, and something in her chest recognized it before her mind fully caught up. The second voice was unfamiliar, a woman's voice, honeyed and clipped at the edges with impatience, saying something about how the paperwork needed to be finalized before Claire's father could be notified, because once family got involved, everything would become complicated and slow. Claire's hand, resting on top of the blanket, went very still. Gregory's voice came again, tighter now, almost pleading. He said that the doctor overseeing her case had already signed off on the sedation protocol, that a second dose was scheduled for later that evening under the guise of pain management, and that once it took effect, given her existing head trauma from the crash, no one would question a decline. He said the word inheritance. He said the word timing. And then the woman's voice, warmer now, almost affectionate in its cruelty, told him not to lose his nerve now, not when they were so close, not when the life insurance policy alone was worth more than either of them would make in a decade of honest work, and certainly not when she, Vanessa, had rearranged her entire life around the promise that this would finally be over soon. Claire lay in that hospital bed and felt something inside her chest cave in and then, strangely, rebuild itself into something harder and more clear-eyed than she had ever been in her life. She did not cry out. She did not move. Every instinct she had, the instincts of a woman who had spent a decade solving problems for demanding clients under impossible deadlines, told her that the only weapon she had in that moment was the fact that they did not yet know she was awake. So she closed her eyes again, slowed her breathing, and let her husband and the woman named Vanessa believe, for just a little longer, that the person they were planning to erase from the world was still peacefully, obliviously unconscious. If any part of this story is resonating with you so far, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments as we go, and if you haven't already, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button so the rest of Claire's journey finds its way to you. Now, back to that hospital room, where a woman who had spent her whole life being patient was about to discover exactly how much strength had been quietly waiting inside her. The footsteps retreated down the hallway a few minutes later, and Claire opened her eyes to the empty room and the too sweet smell of the lilies, and understood that she had perhaps 90 seconds before someone came to check on her. She reached for the call button clipped to her bed rail, not to press it, but simply to hold on to something solid while her mind raced through everything she now knew. Her husband and a woman named Vanessa were planning to have her killed under the cover of medical sedation, in this unnervingly luxurious room that she now understood was not a coincidence, not a kindness, but a stage set specifically for a killing that could be explained away as complications from a car accident. The realization that Gregory had likely arranged for her to be brought here, to this particular wing, with this particular level of privacy, made her stomach turn in a way the accident itself had not. A nurse came in a few minutes later, a woman in her 50s named Rosalind Okafor with kind, tired eyes and a gentle way of checking vitals that made Claire, despite everything, feel a flicker of safety. Claire made a decision in that moment that would define the next several days of her life. She decided to say nothing, not yet, not until she understood who around her could be trusted. She kept her voice soft and slightly confused, playing the part of a woman still shaking off the fog of a head injury, and asked simple questions. Where was she? How long had she been here? Was her family aware? Rosalind answered kindly, telling her she'd been unconscious for almost 2 days after the crash, that she was at Sutherland Regional's private care wing, and that her husband had personally requested the upgraded room, citing her need for a calm recovery environment. Claire thanked her, and when Rosalind asked if she wanted her husband called in, Claire said, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, that she was still very tired, and that she would like a little more time before seeing anyone. Alone again, Claire did the only thing she could think to do. She reached for the room's landline, because her cell phone was nowhere in sight, and dialed the only number she still knew by heart that wasn't Gregory's, her younger sister Margaret's. Margaret picked up on the second ring, her voice cracking with relief the moment she heard Claire was awake, already crying, already promising to come immediately, and Claire, keeping her voice low, told her sister something that made Margaret go completely silent on the other end of the line. She told her not to tell Gregory she was awake. She told her to come alone, and to come now, and to bring their father's old friend, a retired police detective named Walter Higgins who had known Claire since she was a child stealing cookies from his kitchen, and who Margaret's husband still occasionally golfed with. Margaret, who had never in her life heard her older sister sound so controlled and so frightened at once, did not ask a single question. She simply said she was on her way. The 2 hours that followed were, in Claire's own later telling, the longest of her life. She lay in that overly comfortable bed, staring at the door, replaying the conversation she had overheard, trying to piece together timelines and motives with the analytical precision she usually reserved for client contracts. She thought of the life insurance policy Gregory had insisted on increasing 18 months earlier, framing it as responsible planning now that the business was doing well. She thought of the woman named Vanessa, and found herself, with a strange detachment, trying to recall if she had ever met anyone by that name at one of Gregory's work events, a fundraiser, a holiday party. She thought of her own mother, gone 6 years now to an illness that had taken far too long to finish its work, and found herself whispering, to the empty room, a promise that she would not let herself become another woman quietly disappeared from her own story. Margaret arrived just past noon, rushing in with red-rimmed eyes and Walter Higgins close behind her, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with silver hair and the unhurried calm of someone who had spent 30 years walking into rooms far more dangerous than this one. Claire told them everything in a low, steady voice, the words tumbling out faster as she went, the fear she had been holding at bay finally cracking through her composure as she reached the part about the second dose scheduled for that evening. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Walter, to his credit, did not react with disbelief or the gentle skepticism Claire had half expected. He simply pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, the old-fashioned kind with a leather cover, and began asking careful, specific questions. What time exactly had she overheard the conversation? Had she heard any names besides Vanessa's? Did she know which doctor had allegedly signed off on this sedation protocol? Claire answered as best she could, and Walter's expression grew steadily more serious with each answer, though his voice never lost its calm. It was Walter who first raised the possibility that this could not be handled quietly, that if even part of what Claire had overheard was true, they were not dealing with a domestic betrayal alone but with a potential conspiracy involving medical staff, and that meant they needed to move carefully, gathering evidence rather than simply confronting Gregory outright, because a confrontation without proof would only warn him to cover his tracks. He suggested, gently but firmly, that Claire allow herself to be moved to a different facility under a discreet pretext, something plausible enough not to raise Gregory's suspicion, while he quietly looked into the doctor's involvement and the identity of the woman called Vanessa. Claire, who had spent her whole life being the one who held things together for other people, found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply nodding and letting someone else take the wheel. We are so glad you are still with us for this story, and if you have a moment, let us know in the comments what you would have done in Claire's position, lying there and hearing those words. Your comments truly help our community grow, and we read every single one. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, please consider sharing it with a friend or family member who could use a reminder that truth always finds its way into the light eventually. Now, let's return to that hospital room, where Claire's quiet plan for survival was only just beginning. The transfer happened just after 2 that afternoon, arranged by Walter through a former colleague who now worked hospital security, on the official grounds that Claire's insurance required a review of her care level given the unusual private room assignment. It was a thin pretext, but hospitals moved on paperwork and authority, and by the time Gregory returned to the wing that afternoon expecting to find his wife still sedated and unaware, he found instead an empty room and a nurse who explained, apologetically, that Mrs. Bennet had been transferred for an insurance-mandated evaluation and that the family would be notified of her new location once the paperwork cleared. Claire, watching later through Margaret's careful, second-hand account of Gregory's reaction relayed by a nurse Margaret had befriended, felt something close to satisfaction at the thought of her husband's confusion, though it was tangled tightly with grief for the marriage she had genuinely believed in. In her new room, a modest but perfectly adequate space 2 floors up, under the name Claire had asked to be listed by her maiden name, Bennet rather than her married name, Whitfield, Walter got to work. He was retired, but 30 years on the force had left him with a network of people who still owed him favors and still respected his instincts, and within a day he had confirmed 2 things that made the picture horribly clear. First, that the physician who had approved Claire's sedation protocol, a Dr. Marcus Hale, had a documented and troubling financial relationship with a private consulting firm that, buried under several layers of shell structuring, was ultimately owned by a woman named Vanessa Cole. Second, that Vanessa Cole was not, as Claire had feared, some anonymous stranger, but a name that had crossed her path before. After all, she was the interior designer Gregory had hired 18 months earlier to redesign his office suite downtown, a woman Claire had shaken hands with exactly once at a company open house, complimenting her on a fabric swatch before moving on to speak with someone else entirely, never imagining that handshake had been the beginning of the end of her marriage. Claire absorbed this information the way she absorbed most difficult things in her life, quietly and completely, sitting very still with her hands folded in her lap while Walter laid it out for her, Margaret hovering anxiously by the window. There was no dramatic outburst. Instead, something in Claire's face simply hardened, like clay left too long in the sun, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady in a way that made both Margaret and Walter look at her with something like surprise and respect. She said that she did not want revenge, not really, though she understood if that made her sound foolish given everything. What she wanted was proof, real proof, enough to protect herself legally and enough to make sure that no one else, no future woman in Gregory's life, no other confused nurse following an unethical order, would ever be put in the position she had just narrowly escaped. Walter told her that was exactly the right instinct, and that revenge born of fear tended to unravel in court while patience built on evidence tended to hold. Over the following 4 days, while officially recovering from her injuries under a false sense of security that Gregory believed still existed, Claire and Walter built their case with the same careful, methodical energy Claire usually reserved for pitching a difficult client. Walter, working with a former colleague still active in the department, obtained records showing that Dr. Hale had, in the past, been the subject of 2 prior complaints regarding irregular medication protocols, both quietly settled and buried before reaching any formal disciplinary action, likely due to the hospital's reluctance to invite scandal. Margaret, meanwhile, quietly reached out to a friend from college who now worked in family law, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Priya Nair who agreed to meet with Claire discreetly, bringing with her, on her second visit, a private investigator she trusted named Owen Castellano, who specialized in exactly this kind of financial and relational tangle. It was Owen who uncovered the detail that finally connected every loose thread into something undeniable: text messages, recovered through entirely legal means from a shared cloud backup Gregory had apparently forgotten still synced to an old work laptop Claire had access to as a co-signer on the family business insurance, in which Gregory and Vanessa discussed, in increasingly explicit terms over the preceding 3 months, their plan to be together once, as one message chillingly put it, the Claire situation resolves itself. There were messages about the life insurance payout, now increased to $2.3 million. There were messages about Vanessa's growing impatience, her insistence that Gregory was dragging his feet, her reminder that Dr. Hale would not remain cooperative forever without additional payment. And there, dated the very morning of Claire's accident, a message from Vanessa to Gregory that read simply, chillingly, "Today is the day, don't lose your nerve," followed 20 minutes later by Gregory's reply confirming that Claire had left the house on schedule. That last detail landed on Claire like a physical blow, because it meant what she had, until that moment, refused to fully let herself believe: the crash itself had not been an accident of fate but of design. The delivery truck's driver, a man named Curtis Boyle with significant gambling debts that Owen quickly traced to a payment received 2 days before the crash from an account linked to Vanessa's consulting firm, paid to be in a particular intersection at a particular moment. Claire sat with Priya Nair in a small conference room on the 4th floor of the hospital, papers spread across the table between them, and felt the full, staggering weight of what had nearly happened to her. Her husband had not simply fallen out of love with her. He had, with careful and patient cruelty, engineered her death, and when that plan had failed to fully succeed, had simply pivoted to finishing the job from inside a hospital room dressed up to look like comfort and care. If you've made it this far in Claire's story, thank you for staying with us, and we want to gently remind you that if you or someone you love has ever felt unsafe in a relationship, you deserve support, you deserve to be believed, and you are never alone in that fear. We will return to Claire's story in just a moment, but we wanted to pause here and simply say that your presence in our community, watching stories like this one, matters more than you know. If you haven't yet, please consider liking this video and subscribing, because it helps stories about resilience and hope reach the people who need them most. Claire did not confront Gregory that day, or the day after. Priya Nair advised patience, explaining that with evidence this serious, the correct next step was not a dramatic personal confrontation but a carefully coordinated approach involving law enforcement, so that Gregory, Vanessa, and Dr. Hale would have no opportunity to destroy evidence or flee before formal charges could be filed. Walter, through his old department contacts, connected them with a detective named Renata Ashford who specialized in complex financial and conspiracy cases, and who, upon reviewing the evidence Owen and Walter had assembled, moved with a swiftness that surprised even Priya. Within 2 days, Detective Ashford had secured warrants, and a plan was set into motion for what she called a controlled reveal, a moment in which Gregory would be brought in for what he believed was a routine conversation about his wife's medical status and instead find himself facing formal questioning with the full weight of the evidence already in the room. Claire insisted, against the gentle objections of nearly everyone involved, that she be present for that moment. She said she had spent 8 years of her life building a story with this man, and she was not willing to let the final chapter of it happen entirely without her in the room. Detective Ashford, after some negotiation, agreed to let Claire sit in an adjoining observation room, able to see and hear everything through a one-way mirror, though she would not be permitted to enter until the formal questioning concluded. Claire agreed, though privately she suspected, correctly, that watching would prove far more difficult than any confrontation could have been. The morning of the reveal arrived gray and quiet, the kind of overcast Portland morning that made the whole city feel muffled and still, and Claire sat in that small observation room with Margaret's hand gripped tightly in hers, watching through the glass as Gregory Bennet walked into the interview room believing he was there to sign paperwork related to his wife's continued care. He looked, Claire noted with a strange, clinical detachment, exactly as he had looked every morning for the past 8 years, hair combed, jaw freshly shaved, the same navy quarter-zip sweater she had bought him for his birthday 2 years earlier. It was almost unbearable, seeing such ordinary tenderness in the way he still dressed, still moved, knowing what she now knew about the calculations running underneath that familiar surface. Detective Ashford began gently, almost kindly, asking Gregory about his wife's accident, his relationship with Dr. Hale, his recent business dealings with a designer named Vanessa Cole. Claire watched Gregory's easy confidence begin to fracture in small, telling increments, a slight stiffening of his shoulders, a too-quick correction when he misspoke Vanessa's last name and had to catch himself. When Ashford finally placed the recovered text messages on the table between them, sliding them across with the unhurried calm of someone who had done this 100 times, Claire watched her husband's face collapse in on itself, watched 8 years of careful performance crumble into something raw and unrecognizable, a man suddenly confronted with the reality that every quiet cruelty he had assumed was invisible had, in fact, been seen. He did not confess immediately. For nearly 20 minutes, he tried denial, then confusion, then a strange, wounded anger, insisting the messages had been fabricated, that someone was trying to destroy his marriage and his career out of jealousy. It was only when Detective Ashford mentioned Curtis Boyle by name, and the payment traced from Vanessa's consulting account 2 days before the crash, that something in Gregory finally broke entirely, and he put his face in his hands and began, in a low, shaking voice, to talk. He said things Claire had never imagined she would hear her husband say, about mounting business debts he had hidden from her for over a year, about a construction project that had failed spectacularly and left him drowning, about Vanessa's promises that together they could solve everything if Claire simply were not in the way, about how what had begun as desperate late-night conversation had somehow, over months, calcified into a plan he had told himself, again and again, he would never actually go through with, right up until the morning he did. Claire sat in that observation room and cried, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, tears simply sliding down her face as she listened to the man she had loved describe, in his own words, the slow erosion of whatever conscience had once made him someone worth loving. Margaret held her the entire time, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say that would make any of it smaller or easier to carry. When it was finally over, when Gregory had been formally arrested along with, within the following 48 hours, both Vanessa Cole and Dr. Marcus Hale, Detective Ashford came to find Claire in the observation room, and instead of the triumphant satisfaction Claire had expected to feel, she found only a vast, aching exhaustion, and beneath it, quietly, unexpectedly, a kind of relief so deep it felt almost like grief. We know this part of the story is heavy, and if it's stirring something up for you, please be gentle with yourself. If this story has touched your heart in any way, we would be so grateful if you would like this video, leave a meaningful comment about what stood out to you most, share it with someone who might need a reminder that truth and courage can outlast even the darkest betrayal, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like Claire's. We're almost at the end of her journey now, and what comes next might surprise you, because it isn't only about justice. It's about what Claire chose to build afterward. The weeks that followed were not the triumphant, cinematic resolution one might expect from the moment of a villain's downfall. Instead, they were slow and gray and complicated, full of legal proceedings and insurance disputes and the strange, disorienting task of packing up a house that had once been a home and now felt like a crime scene dressed in familiar furniture. Claire moved in temporarily with Margaret and her husband, sleeping in their guest room under a quilt her mother had made decades earlier, and found that the hardest part of surviving betrayal was not the fear or even the grief, but the quiet, persistent work of learning to trust her own judgment again after discovering how thoroughly it had been deceived. Dr. Marcus Hale, faced with overwhelming evidence and the very real prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, agreed to a plea deal in exchange for testifying fully against both Gregory and Vanessa, admitting under oath that he had been paid to falsify medical documentation and had known, with sickening clarity, exactly what the second sedation dose was meant to accomplish. Vanessa Cole, for her part, showed no such willingness to cooperate, maintaining her innocence through a series of increasingly desperate legal maneuvers that ultimately collapsed under the weight of the financial trail Owen Castellano had assembled. Gregory, in the end, chose to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and multiple counts of fraud, a decision his own lawyer later told Priya Nair had been driven less by remorse than by the simple mathematics of a case he could not hope to win. Claire attended every hearing she was legally permitted to attend, not out of any desire for spectacle, but because she had decided, somewhere in those long gray weeks, that she was done being someone things happened to. She sat in the courtroom with her spine straight and her hands folded, and when the judge finally read the sentence that would send Gregory to prison for the better part of 2 decades, Claire felt none of the vindication she might once have expected. What she felt instead, watching the man she had married led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, was something closer to sorrow, the specific, complicated sorrow of mourning not the man himself but the version of him she had once believed was real, the version who had proposed to her on a rainy afternoon in a bookstore because he knew how much she loved the smell of old paper, the version who did not, as it turned out, exist anywhere outside her own hopeful imagination. It was in the months after the trial that Claire's story took the turn that mattered most, though it was far quieter than anything that had come before it. She used a portion of the life insurance payout, which the courts eventually released to her once Gregory's guilt was firmly established, not to disappear into comfort, but to expand her design studio into a larger space downtown, one with tall windows that let in the gray Portland light she had once found so ordinary and now found she genuinely loved. She hired 2 more employees, both young women just starting their careers, and found, to her quiet surprise, that mentoring them, watching them grow more confident with every project, gave her a kind of purpose that felt entirely her own for the first time in years. She reconnected more deeply with her father, the watch repairman, spending Sunday afternoons in his workshop learning, slowly and clumsily, how to take apart small broken mechanisms and put them back together correctly, finding in the precise, patient work a kind of meditation she hadn't known she needed. She did not, for a long time, believe she would ever trust another person romantically again, and she told herself, and told Margaret, that this was fine, that a full life did not require it. But nearly 2 years after the trial, at a small business networking event she had almost skipped, she found herself in a long, easy conversation with a man named Theo Marchetti, a soft-spoken structural engineer with kind eyes and an unhurried way of listening that reminded her, in the best possible way, of her father. Their friendship grew slowly, carefully, over many months, with none of the whirlwind urgency that had characterized her courtship with Gregory, and Claire found that this slowness was not a weakness but a gift, a chance to build something on a foundation she had actually inspected herself, board by board, rather than simply trusting was sound. Before we reach the very end of Claire's story, we would love for you to take a moment and leave a comment telling us what this story means to you. Perhaps it's about the courage it takes to trust yourself even when someone you love has deceived you. Perhaps it's about how patience and quiet strength can accomplish what panic never could. Perhaps it's simply about believing that even after the darkest betrayal, a good and honest life is still possible. Whatever it is, we would love to hear it in the comments below, because these stories only mean something when we get to share them together as a community. Claire Bennett is 51 now, though at the time all of this happened she was only 34, and in the years since, she has told this story only a handful of times, usually to women who come to her, quietly and carefully, after hearing whispers of what she survived, women standing at the edge of their own frightening realizations, unsure whether their instincts can be trusted. To each of them, Claire says roughly the same thing, the thing she has come to believe most deeply in the world, that the moment you realize something is wrong is not the moment to panic, but the moment to become very, very still, and very, very clear-eyed, because clarity, more than anger, more than fear, is the thing that will carry you safely to the other side of even the worst betrayal. She tells them that she does not regret the 8 years she spent believing in a marriage that turned out to be built on sand, because those years taught her how to love fully, and that full-hearted capacity for love did not die with Gregory's betrayal, it simply found, eventually, someone worthy of receiving it. On the morning of her wedding to Theo, held in her father's small backyard under a maple tree just beginning to turn gold, Claire stood at the makeshift altar and thought, unexpectedly, of that hospital room, of the sound of her own name in a voice she had trusted, of the 90 seconds in which she had decided, without fully knowing it yet, to fight for her own life with every ounce of quiet strength she possessed. She thought that the woman who had lain so still in that bed, listening to her own death being planned in hushed tones just beyond the door, could never have imagined that she would one day stand in golden autumn light, surrounded by a sister who had never once hesitated to come running, a father who had taught her that broken things could be repaired with patience, and a man whose love, unlike the love she had known before, asked nothing of her but honesty. Claire Bennett had woken up in a VIP hospital room believing her life was ending. What she had not known then, what she could not possibly have known, was that it was only just beginning. If Claire's story touched your heart today, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment about the part that moved you most, share it with someone who might need a reminder that hope survives even the darkest chapters, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Thank you for spending this time with us, and for believing, alongside our whole community, in kindness, in forgiveness, and in the quiet, unstoppable power of second chances.